In this video, we'll go over how you can leverage the trending control in your mimics. Trending is an important part of any HMI system and allows you to display data over a period of time that is easily understood. We'll also go over our trending control and what it's capable of. To get started, let's create a new mimic. I'll do this now by clicking the New File button at the top, then choosing a regular mimic type. I'll then give this mimic the name Trend Mimic and click OK to finish the creation process. Now that we have our mimic, we can add our trend control to it. The trend can be found in the toolbox under the Trend category. If you expand it, you'll see there's two options listed here: the Add Pin and the Trend Graph. The Trend Graph is the main display portion of the trend, so let's draw one out and take a look at what we can do with it. Right off the bat, we've got a decent view to display some data. We've got a title we can set, there's some time domain labels, and an area for us to display the range of the data being presented. All of these settings are configurable as well. If we look at the properties in the toolbox, we'll see ones like setting the frequency on the domain axis, legend placement, domain time start, data modes, and also properties for changing the visual aspects such as the background and foreground colors. Now that we have a trend, we need to add at least one pin to it before we'll see any data. Pins can be added by either clicking the Add Pin option in the toolbox while the graph is selected, or can be added by selecting the graph, then right-clicking to bring up the context menu for the trend graph. I'll go ahead and do this now. You'll see that the graph area has been populated with some range indicators, which means our pin has been added to the graph. If I come up to the document tree and then expand our trend graph item, we'll see that our pin has been listed as a child of the trend. I can then select this and see all of the properties it has. From here, I can adjust all sorts of properties like the fill mode and other visual aspects of the pin. There are some additional properties on the trend that let you control how data is presented. Of these properties, the ones you'll be using most frequently are probably the data mode, display time start, and then the major and minor grid frequencies. The data mode allows you to specify whether you want live or historical data, or even a mixture of both. The display time start lets you set the time you want the data to begin showing from, while the major and minor grid frequencies allow you to control how often grid lines are displayed in the graph area. There are other properties you can set on the trend graph and pin as well, like how the pins shade, whether it will show labels for the data or not, and much more. I definitely recommend that you try these out so you can see just how much freedom you have in styling your trend. Now that we have a pin, we need to bind some data to it. Bindings to pins are just like any other binding in Status Enterprise. You select your item, then choose your property, and finally apply the binding. Let's go ahead and do this now. I'm going to select my graph pin, then browse through my model and find the asset TB1001. Once I've found it, I'll then expand it and look for the generator component on it. I'll then expand that and find voltage. Next, I'll choose value as the property, and then I'll click Apply to add this binding. The next thing we need to do is adjust the range on this pin so we can see the data. To do this, you'll need to change both the range minimum and range maximum properties, which is what I'm going to do now. If I recall correctly, the voltage property fluctuates between 290 and 320 as the value, so I'm going to change the minimum to roughly 280, then set the maximum to 320. Next, I'll need to save this mimic and we'll be ready to test this out in the runtime. I'll save it by clicking the Save button, then choosing my mimics view. Then I'll click the test run to launch the mimic runtime and click Connect to log in. Now that our mimic is loaded, let's give this a minute so we can see it trending some data for us. As you can see, our data is being plotted on the graph in a clear and easy to read format. We can then move our mouse along the trend line to get the exact value of the data at that point in time. The trend can also display historical data. This can be done a couple of different ways. You can switch the pin during runtime to display this data, or you can configure the pin so that it's displaying historical data by default. The first one we'll look at is how to configure the pin so that it's displaying this historical data. So I'm going to make sure I have my graph pin selected, then find the data mode property in my property list. For this demonstration, I'll set the data mode to historical only. Next, I'm going to select the trend graph itself and change its data mode to historical only as well. Then I'll find domain display time and change the minute to 52. This will give us roughly 5 minutes of historical data to view when we run this. Next, I'll save this mimic, then click the Test Run button. I'll click Connect to log in. And when this loads, you'll see that we're now viewing our historical data. We can also configure this display range at runtime as well by clicking this settings icon. It will then bring up some options you can set to control what kind of data is being displayed, how much is being displayed, and so on. So, for example, if I change this to 45, it will give us about 15 minutes or so of data. But let's say we only want to see 10, so I'm going to set 10, and then I'll change my grid frequency to 2.5 minutes. When I'm happy with these settings, I can click the X to get rid of this dialog, and now we've got our new range of data being displayed. Also, you probably noticed that this gives you the option of switching between either historical or real-time depending on what your default configuration for your trend is. In closing, Status Enterprise is a powerful, easy-to-use tool that lets you design once and deploy multiple times. For more information about Status Enterprise and trending, please visit us on the web at www.scada.com.